If you really believe that every human being is precious and that every life is sacred, that can't mean only every Jewish life is sacred. And it also can't mean every Palestinian life is sacred, but don't tell me about the Jews. And if your heart only breaks for one but not the other, then you're not actually a humanitarian. You don't actually care about human rights.
Hey, I'm Ashley Jackson, and this is Push the Next Generation, your Gen Z coded guide to power and politics. Today we're decoding the intersection of spirituality and social justice. Time for some quick news updates, and then we'll start our interview. Special Counsel Jack Smith is preparing to release a comprehensive report on federal investigations into President-elect Donald Trump before January 20th, 2025. This follows Smith's move to dismiss all federal charges against Trump, citing DOJ policy against prosecuting a sitting president. The report is expected to detail findings on election interference and classified document handling cases. President-elect Donald Trump has pledged to impose a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico, escalating trade tensions as he transitions back to the White House. Damian Williams, Manhattan's top federal prosecutor, has resigned, marking a significant change in leadership amid ongoing high-profile cases. The strike at Canada Post continues, with negotiations reportedly making limited progress affecting package deliveries ahead of the holiday season. Voters in Nova Scotia are going to the polls as Premier Tim Houston seeks re-election. Key issues include economic management and healthcare. Negotiations for a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah are reportedly progressing, with both sides seeking to de-escalate ongoing hostilities. At least 6 people have died during protests in Pakistan, demanding the release of former Prime Minister Imran Khan, highlighting ongoing political unrest in the country. Tensions also remain high between Ukraine and Russia, with reports of missile strikes and military mobilizations continuing along the border. And Storm Bert has caused flooding in parts of the UK and Ireland, prompting warnings from meteorological authorities about severe weather conditions. And because this is also newsworthy, Drake has filed a lawsuit against Universal Music Group and Spotify, alleging artificial inflation of the streaming numbers of Kendrick Lamar's diss track Not Like Us. The legal action claims UMG used bots to boost Spotify streams, payola schemes for radio play, paid social media influencer promotions. Drake seeks to expose what he claims are unethical marketing practices. UMG has denied the allegations, calling them offensive and false, and the lawsuit represents an escalation of the ongoing Drake-Kendrick Lamar hip-hop rivalry. And finally, as a theater girly, I am happy to report that the film adaptation of Wicked had a record-breaking opening weekend, grossing $114 million domestically and $164.2 million globally. This marks the highest-grossing debut for any Broadway musical film, surpassing previous records held by Les Mis and Into the Woods. Now that we're all caught up, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Push the Next Generation, recommend it to a friend, follow on socials at Push the Next Generation Pod, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Okay, now that the begging is over, let's get into it. This week, I'll be speaking with Rabbi Sharon Brous. She is the senior and founding rabbi of Ikar, a leading-edge Jewish community based in Los Angeles, and author of The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World, a national bestseller. Brous offered the invocation at the Democratic National Convention this year and has led the Hanukkah candle lighting and White House Passover Seder during the Biden-Harris administration. She also blessed President Biden and Vice President Harris at the inaugural National Prayer Service in 2021, and in 2013 she blessed President Obama and Vice President Biden. She was named number 1 on the Newsweek The Daily Beast list of most influential rabbis in America and has been recognized by many as among the most influential Jews alive today. Her 2016 TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, has been viewed by more than 1.5 million people. Currently, Brous is in the inaugural cohort of Auburn Seminary's Senior Fellows Program, which unites top faith leaders working on the front lines for justice. She also sits on the faculty of Reboot, serves on the International Council of the New Israel Fund, and is on the National Steering Committee of the Poor People's Campaign. A graduate of Columbia University with both undergraduate and a master's degree in human rights, she was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary. It should come as no surprise that I've grown up around many different faith leaders across a broad theological spectrum, and within that context, I'm so excited to introduce this audience to one of the most extraordinary humanitarians of our time. Welcome, Rabbi Brous. Hi, Rabbi Brous. It's so nice to have you on Push the Next Generation. So fun.
Hi, Ashley. It's so good to see you.
Likewise. So I think there's many things I want to talk to you about today, but I think some of these questions require a framework for our audience. So I'd love for you to explain how you define and see Judaism before we get into the conversation.
Yeah, of course. Judaism is an ancient faith tradition that at its core tells the story of the Israelite people who because of famine, actually, because of climate devastation, left their home in the Promised Land and went down to Egypt searching for food and were enslaved and humiliated and degraded for hundreds of years and actually became a people in the process of emerging from enslavement and seeking liberation in partnership with God and walking back to the promised land where they received the Torah, this blueprint for living. And essentially, four of the five books of the Torah, which is our most core and sacred text, tell the story of that process of liberation, that long walk to freedom, as Nelson Mandela called it. And almost every Jewish holiday in some way refers back to that experience of what's called Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving from the narrow place and entering a place of expansiveness. So, with that at the core of our faith and of our history, comes this sense of responsibility, not only to pursue a theology of liberation, but also to enact liberation as part of our raison d'etre as a people. And that's the story that's kind of tracked throughout the last several thousand years. It's an interpretive tradition. So we read the text through the lens of generations of rabbis and interpreters who've essentially helped us answer the question, what does it mean to be a human being in the world? How do we navigate a world of injustice and human cruelty and callousness? And in every generation, try to move closer and closer toward a world of redemption.
That's really, really beautiful. Thank you for explaining for the audience. And knowing that you are a rabbi, I'd love to know if you could share some of the pivotal moments that led for you to make that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up a secular Jew, pretty connected to my Jewish identity, but very disconnected from serious Jewish learning and Jewish literacy. I did not have any real spiritual or religious practice, and I had a series of experiences when I was in college in which I felt really drawn into Jewish communal spaces. And honestly, every time I entered, I just felt humiliated and pushed away because it's hard to be a Jew. I mean, there's so many rules and so many assumptions about what people know, and there's posturing and positioning, and when we bow and when we stand up, and what words we say and what words we don't say. And I felt so ashamed of my ignorance. And I wanted to flee the Jewish community, but a series of events kind of drew me back in. And I realized that I needed to learn. I wanted to learn what my grandparents had known innately from their parents and grandparents and great grandparents, but then they had decided in this quest to become American, the Americanization, the Protestantization of American Jewry, that they had decided to leave behind some of those practices. And I really had a kind of hunger to learn. This led me to Jerusalem, where I studied my junior year in college. And when I was there, I had a kind of epiphany. I had this revelatory experience when I was in the Old City in Jerusalem one Shabbat. I realized that many of the people I admired most in the world, people who are really agents of social change in the world, were driven by a faith narrative. That it wasn't just some sense that people should be good to each other. It was the sense that there should be order in this world, and that God stood on the side of righteousness and justice. And I kind of had a revelation where I realized that I had a faith narrative that was at the heart of my very being, that was part of what had quietly been propelling me my whole life to be, to be animated around issues like homelessness and poverty and even environmental issues back in that time, which now we would call climate justice issues. I was really animated around about racism and about trying to imagine a different kind of society, a different kind of world. And I never thought that it was my faith that was the driving force. And when I was sitting in Jerusalem in the Old City, at the end of this really like long and powerful weekend, I realized that it was this faith story that we started with, the story of the Exodus from Egypt, that really was at the heart of my understanding of why we needed to build a world in which all people could be free, in which redemption was possible for everybody, and that was the deepest expression of my faith and of my humanity. And I remember I called my parents when I got back to my dorm where I was living at the end of that day, and I said to them, "I'm going to be a rabbi." And my parents were so upset, and my mom immediately blurted out, "I thought you said you wanted to do something good for the world." And I mean, they were completely shocked because they didn't have in their mind an image of a rabbinate that would actually be about helping to make a more just and loving society. And I said to them, but that's the kind of rabbinate that I want to build. And they became very supportive of my rabbinate, very quickly. But I really wanted to envision our Jewish community as one that was really taking this history, taking both our most sacred text and tradition, and also our history, frankly, of persecution and oppression, and and using that as a real moral force that would call us into the work with multi-faith partners of building a more just and loving society. That really became the heart of my faith and the heart of my rabbinate.
Well, I just think it's really, really wonderful that you made that choice. I think that you have become such a beacon of light for so many as a result of your choice to do such a wonderful thing with your work. But to that point, I actually was wondering, being a female rabbi, particularly, I'm if I understand correctly, it's not a historically female position to hold. And I just want to know how you've navigated that. Like, have you encountered a level of misogyny? Like, what is it like for you in this space that you hold?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I don't know any woman professional that hasn't encountered some measure of misogyny in their
Right.
space. I will, but yes, you're right that this is a historically male role. In my class, when I was ordained as a rabbi in 2001, there were, including us, including the women in my class, 120 women rabbis in my movement. There were another maybe 100 from the Reform movement, and so it was a pretty small cohort of women rabbinic leaders. Now there are more, and there are even modern Orthodox institutions that are ordaining
Hmm.
women. It's interesting. The first, I would say, 7 years of my rabbinate, whenever I was invited to speak publicly or sit on a panel, it was to talk about women and faith, women and the Bible, women and Judaism.
Hmm.
And I remember the moment when I was asked to just speak about Judaism or about Torah or about social justice and faith communities. And it felt like a transition, both for me and also for our community, that there was a moment where we could actually start to see women leaders, not as women leaders, but just as leaders.
As
And that
leaders,
felt
yeah.
to me like a really critical moment of transition. And in fact, just the end of the Jewish holidays this year was this holiday called Simchat Torah, where we come together all this very heady, very difficult work of soul searching and really saying the hard things out loud, both personally and collectively. We end by dancing, and even dancing through our sorrow, dancing through our pain. And we just dance for hours and hours and hours. And we introduce each of the 7 dances that we do that night with a little kind of word of inspiration, like 2 minutes. And what we decided to do was to highlight this year's 7 prophets from our tradition. And so each one of those little introductions was about one of these 7 prophets. And if people were paying attention, they might have noticed that all 7 of those prophets are women. But we explicitly said that we weren't going to ever speak about 7 women prophets. We were just going to talk about 7 prophets and what we could learn from them. And I feel like
Right.
this is that moment where we're changing our understanding of what a rabbi looks like, what a prophet looks like, what leadership looks like. And now, Ashley, there's a generation of children who grew up at Ikar who think that this is what a rabbi looks like. And so for them,
Right.
whereas I spent many years with people saying you don't look like a rabbi, and now, we're changing the understanding of what a rabbi looks like. rabbis are women, rabbis are queer, rabbis are black, rabbis are Asian. We are a complex and diverse people, and that should be reflected in our leadership.
I think that is so beautiful. And you're right to the point that like in every profession as a woman, you do kind of have to get past that I want to say blockage in a way of people's viewpoints and understandings, even sometimes in spaces of when you're a person of color and you walk in the room and they're like, oh, we need you to speak on the issue relative to the person of color. But it's like, oh, what if I'm an expert in tech? Like we're not talking about me in tech, we're talking about my issues in like DEI. So I think that's really, really important to address. So one of the things I was doing a little digging online, nothing too crazy, but I have seen over and over again that you've been referred to as one of the most influential Jewish leaders in America, which I I am not that person, and that feels like a lot to hold. Some days I can imagine, and so I want to know from you as a prominent religious leader how you maintain your own spiritual well-being and your own growth while like holding that responsibility and advocating for social justice and like being a mom, a wife, like all of the things. How do you do it? Because it feels like a lot to hold. And so I just wanted to provide space for that before we keep going.
Well, I'll say a couple things about that. Number one, I have to hold a lot of humility in this role because I am speaking from a very old tradition, thousands of years old, that holds the dreams of my people and the pain of my people. And I don't know that I'm right. I don't know that my interpretation is the right interpretation, but I know it's the only one that I can speak from. And so I'm always open to learning and to hearing different interpretations and to hearing other perspectives. And I believe that my role and my responsibility is to speak as clearly as I can as a moral leader in this time of so much brokenness and heartache and sorrow. And so that's the only voice I know how to use. And so I feel like the work that I'm doing is my best attempt to represent this very old and very sacred tradition, in the truest and most authentic way that I know to be possible. The only way that I can do that is by having really I have a community, thank God, that really supports me in saying things that I believe need to be said, even uncomfortable and hard things, and that is very rare. In faith communities, not just Jewish, obviously, but in lots of faith communities, we have people who think that they want their faith leaders to be moral leaders, but then as soon as they push them in an uncomfortable way, they want to pull back. And I mean, I'm thinking even about Dr. King's speech in Riverside Church when he was talking about the war in Vietnam and how many people from, in the Black church movement said, like, that's not what we want you talking about. We need to stay focused on domestic issues. We're not getting involved in the war. And he said,
Right.
how can I not speak out against this war? This is part of what moral leadership is. It's saying things that, not being a cheerleader of the ideas of the people in the pews, but actually saying things that are sometimes really hard to hear. And that's painful because I care a lot about my people. I don't want to upset people. That's not who I am. And also, I know my job is not to be a people pleaser, but to actually say the hard things out loud and hopefully to say it with enough love and hopefully with enough credibility that I've earned over these years by being an honest arbiter of the tradition, that people will be able to hear it. What gives me strength is having a community and really a board of directors that actually trusts me to share what I see in the text and tradition and also in the world, and wants me to use my voice even to say uncomfortable and hard things. That is really critical. And I feel because I have the privilege of having that wonderful community and support, that I have to use the platform to say things that I think would be hard in other contexts to say. But the other piece of your question is about really where do I find the strength personally, spiritually, to navigate this time. That's what I heard in your question, which is such a
Yeah.
sensitive and thoughtful question. Spoken like the daughter of a faith leader. I you know I I have no idea how I would survive this work without Shabbat, without the Sabbath. This is the most sacred and central practice to my in my faith tradition. The idea that at the end of every single week, no matter what's going on in the world, no matter what deadlines I'm facing, no matter what challenges I'm facing, everything gets shut down. The computer's off, the phones are off. We're just human beings for 25 hours. We sit together at the Shabbat dinner table. We sing together. We talk to each other. My kids, play games with me. Like we play bananagrams and we engage like human beings at the dinner table. Um, we pray for hours and then we have a beautiful lunch together the next day and then we take a nap. In other words, there's a ministry of self-care that's actually built into Jewish religious practice. And it's not just self-care for its own sake. It's because the assumption is that if your work in the world is to build a world redeemed, a world in which all people can experience liberation, a world free of racism and economic injustice and climate injustice and misogyny and human cruelty, then you need all your strength. And you can't actually run on a treadmill forever. At some point, you have to stop and
Right.
you have to take a breath and drink a bottle of water. And if you don't, you're going to die at some point. And so, what we do is, it's such wisdom. This ancient wisdom of the Sabbath is you have to pause, and you pause at intervals that are uncomfortably regular. There's no
Right.
break.
Yeah.
Even when the election is 3 days away, we're going to put our phones down and we're going to pause. And we're going to get up Saturday night and Sunday and canvass and knock on doors and make phone calls. But you pause because our humanity depends on the pause. And for me, as a faith leader, I have to pause. I have to pause with my community. We have to sing together for hours. And I have to pause with my family. And we go on walks on Shabbat. And again, I sit
Hmm.
with my teenagers at the dinner table and nobody has phones and nobody wants their phones. Like we're all grateful that there are no devices in the room.
Right.
And we teach each other songs that we've learned that we love. And like there's something so precious and powerful about we talk about ideas. We talk about long form articles that we read that we were upset about or inspired by. We talk about novels that we're reading. Like this is a very ancient idea that in this time is I think the most compelling and urgent response to a lot of the pain of the time that we're living in, the pain of disconnection and ideological division and an inability to look at each
Hmm.
other and understand each other and hear each other. We have a practice that says, well, sit down at the table together and just see what you might learn about each other and from each other. And for me, that's the spiritual fuel that makes it possible for me to do the work during the week, whether that work is on the prophetic side of the faith leader, mandate, or on the pastoral side, which is equally challenging and gutting and hard because there's all kinds of loss that we're engaging and, all
Yeah.
kinds of human yearning that's part of the job too. So this is the sacred fuel that makes it possible, I think, for me to engage in the work.
That is so beautiful to hear. And I think, just speaking, I guess, from a personal perspective, like I was talking to my mom yesterday about just feeling the weight of the world and how exhausting it is not to just be okay, I'm 25 and I'm navigating grad school, not just to like exist in these other sectors like, oh, friends and dating and all the things, but the world feels so heavy every single day. And that would just be enough. And then you add your own life on top of it and trying to figure out how to navigate that and like finding a practice that works for you in spirituality that is meaningful and also allows you the rest that we all deserve and need and a break from the constant scrolling and the constant like all of the headlines. And so it really sounds beautiful to think of that as a new way forward in many ways in terms of us being able to just breathe. It's a hard time.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to just say one thing about this. One of the teachers who influenced my thinking about this most is a rabbi named Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who wrote a book called The Jewish Way years ago. And I read I read the whole book. I read year after year because it's so powerful. I read his chapter on Shabbat maybe 25 years ago. It changed my life because he describes that essentially our tradition, the Jewish tradition, promises that every human being is created in God's own image. And that means that every single person in the world has infinite worth, is fundamentally equal to every other person, and has some unique purpose in the world that only we can fulfill. That of the billions of people alive in the world today, every single one of us is precious in this way. But we live in a world that actually makes a mockery of that dream. And so, how do you hold your deepest faith commitment with the reality of the world when there's such a dissonance between the two? And he makes this argument that the only way to do that is once a week to step out of the world as it is and imagine again the world as it could be. And once we do, so when we enter Shabbat, we're not just napping and singing and putting away our phones. We're actually creating a little taste of the world as it could be. And we're reminding ourselves this is our dream for everyone. And there are all these stories about, like, poor old Jews living in the shtetl and with pogroms and violence and cruelty. But on Shabbat, they're kings and queens, right? Like on Shabbat, on this one day, we sit at the table and we put like a beautiful tablecloth out and our nicest dishes. And we just, like, with whatever we have, we just imagine that every person lives in their fullest dignity. And that is a revolutionary act. And what
Yeah.
Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg says about this, which I've been completely convinced by and built my whole religious life around, is that that is what makes us prophets of eternal dissent. That we are constantly living in a dissenting posture from the world as it is, and envisioning instead and lifting up a vision in the public square of the world as it could be, because every single week we're reminded of what the world could be, and so we're reinvigorating this dream on the weekly. It's not like this is something that our parents once told us about and we remember that dream. We're living that dream week after week after week, and that becomes core to who we are and how we live in the world and what we're working toward, and how we vote, how we read the paper, how we, how we make phone calls and write postcards and knock on door. All of that is informed by this lens that we remember the dream and we see the gap between the dream of the world as it could be and the reality of the world as it is. And we're committed to bridging that gap, if not in our lifetime, then in our children's lifetime.
That's so profound. And I think a lot of people, I mean, we'll get into the state of the world today in many terms in a moment, but I think a lot of people don't hear this when they hear Judaism, as like the first thing that they think of is not this. And so like I understand like there's tikkun olam and like building like all of these ways in which you use your social justice drive and your morality to fuel your faith and work and vice versa. And so I just wanted to kind of start with this because I feel like sometimes people immediately go, I don't want to hear this. This sounds like I'm not going to like it. But like, I think that most people would agree with what you've said and resonate with that. So that is such a beautiful framework. But speaking of frameworks, I think we really should define anti-Semitism before we get into the next part of this discussion, just because I think, the internet, we use it as a tool for many great things, and also it can be a really harmful place and also a place just rife with misinformation. And I look to you as a moral leader in many ways, and so I'd love for you to just define this for everyone so we can get on the road with it.
Yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism is a position of hatred or callousness or cruelty toward Jewish people or the Jewish faith and Jewish tradition. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism that functions differently than anti-Black racism does. And so it's misunderstood by a lot of people, especially in the States, because the dominant form of racism that we are finally becoming educated about in the US is anti-Black racism. And anti-Semitism is a form of racism. It grows from the same kind of cancerous, tree, and yet it functions differently. Some of the ways that anti-Semitism functions, I think, are rooted in the sense that it's a grand conspiracy theory that argues that Jews control the government, the weather, the banks, Hollywood, that Jews, this tiny population, have this extended, disproportionate control over the world, and that control ends up fueling not only a desire but a need to suppress the Jewish voice and to suppress the Jewish population, so that the good people of the world can take back control over their lives, over their government, over their money, over the environment. And anti-Semitism really thrives in environments in which people feel discontent with what's going on. Because if you're told
Yeah.
that there's some big bad guy operating behind the scenes that's making it so that you lost your job to some multinational corporation, you're very compelled by that idea. If you're told that there's someone out there who's controlling the mechanisms of the weather and making it so that there's a hurricane in your, in
Space
your
lasers.
neighborhood, as crazy as that
Yeah.
sounds, millions and millions of people believe this. And you want to believe it because we want to live in a world of order, not a world of chaos. And so when there's an argument that's made that there is someone who's a kind of nefarious puppeteer that's behind all of the pain that you're experiencing, that's putting messaging out into the world because the Jews run Hollywood, and that's responsible for all of your heartache, it's natural to want to grasp on to those conspiracies. And this is
Right.
precisely what happened in Europe in the 20th century. And what's so dangerous about this moment is that we're seeing those very same arguments about these Jewish conspiracy theory arguments that are now manifesting. And honestly, they're not just coming from the far right. And one of the things that we know about anti-Semitism is that the real danger to the Jewish people comes when anti-Semitism from the far right matches anti-Semitism from the far left. When those two, when the sort of head and tail of the thing meet. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, a lot of that is what we're seeing in our time right now. And I want to just be really clear about this, that anti-Semitism does not only threaten Jews. I mean, certainly it threatens me and my community and my family. But anti-Semitism is like the canary in the coal mine, because you cannot build an anti-racist society that holds on to racism against Jewish people. And when anti-Semitism thrives,
Right.
all forms of racism thrive. And when anti-Semitism thrives, democracy itself is at stake. And so I want us to think about anti-Semitism as a form of racism, but one that functions differently from anti-Black racism. There's some similarities and some differences, as a series of conspiracy theories that really human beings who are hurting and in real pain want to attach to, because we want to
Right.
understand why we're suffering so much. And as a threat not only to the Jews, but as a threat to all minority communities and as a threat to democracy itself. And I think once we understand it that way, then we can ask this question, which is, why is anti-Semitism thriving right now? And the answer to that is that there are people who benefit from a society that is torn apart by anti-Semitism, who
Hmm.
profit who profit when anti-Semitism is thriving in a society, who profit from a wedge being driven between Jews and Blacks, which, by the way, there are many Jews who are also Black. They're Black Jews. And
Hmm.
so they're put in a particularly precarious position. But who benefits when there's a wedge in the democracy movement, for example, when anti-Semitism starts to thrive, not only from the right, but also from the left? There are people
Hmm.
who benefit from that and who are actually fueling the machinery of hatred against Jews, precisely because they know and understand that this will not only impact the tiny percentage of the population of Jewish people, but because they know that this is the way that we can actually undo democracy. And that, I think, is widely misunderstood when we talk about anti Semitism. And I think if more people understood that, more people would be I think, not only on board with, but understand the mandate to eradicate anti-Semitism as a very serious piece of creating an anti-racist society.
Right. And I think I'm putting myself in the shoes of lots of people who I know will be listening who say, okay, but first let's not have a but to begin with, because I think that right there is something that should stand on its own. But to add to that, I know that there are a lot of people who go, okay, I'm not anti-Semitic, but I do oppose the views and the actions of the current Israeli government. I do oppose X, Y, and Z. And so, like, how do you frame to them, okay, like I don't even know really how to ask the question of how do you separate Judaism, Jewish people, Israeli government? Like, I think we are conflating a lot of different ideas, ideologies, and systems and beings into one bucket that I think first needs to be separated. But if you could just walk people through how you kind of do that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first thing is that assuming that any Israeli Jew, let alone any diaspora Jew, is responsible for the views and behaviors of Israel's government is to grossly misunderstand how government works. I mean, I'm an American who lived in this country under the Trump administration.
Right.
I still paid my taxes. I protested every week. I used my platform and my pulpit and my voice to speak out against my government, but I was still an American. I did not renounce my American citizenship, right?
Right.
And so I think it's important for people to know that on the street, every single week, for nearly 2 years now, there have been hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews who've been protesting against the actions of their government, who do not support this right-wing, hardline, ultra-nationalist, racist, messianic government that is really pushing Israel off the edge of the abyss. There are hundreds of thousands of people. It is essentially the equivalent in American terms, proportionally, because Israel's a tiny country. So when hundreds of thousands of people take to the street, it's the equivalent of 30 or 35 million Americans taking to the street to protest week after week after week, which never happened in the United States.
Right.
Even under the Trump administration, even when he called for the Muslim ban, even when the kids were in cages, we never saw 35 million Americans, even when
Right.
when he promised he was going to overturn Roe, and then when Roe was overturned. And so what I want people to understand is there is a very vibrant resistance and opposition force in Israeli society that is fighting for democracy, that is fighting for civil society. Within that movement, there is a small but mighty force that is profoundly anti-occupation, that is dreaming of what shared society needs to look like, that is fighting for a just and peaceful future with Israelis and Palestinians living side by side. There is a very vibrant resistance force within Israeli society. Now, take a step outside of Israel and look at diaspora Jews. There are people who hold increasingly any Jew anywhere in the world, whether you're in Sydney, Australia, or in Paris, or in Los Angeles, or New York City, responsible for the decisions of the government of the state of Israel. That is racist. That is racist. That's like holding any black person responsible for Charles Taylor's regime, across the ocean. That is
Yeah.
racism, right? I'm as responsible for Bibi Netanyahu's decisions and the decisions of this war cabinet as any Chinese American is for the Chinese government's decisions when it comes to the Uyghurs. Now, one of the ways that one of my colleagues, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, explained this in a really helpful and profound way, I think. What she said, and I totally agree with her, is to speak out and even protest against this terrible war that now has been going on for over a year
Far
is
too
not,
long.
it is not only acceptable, it might even be morally obligatory to bring that protest to the sidewalk in front of an Israeli American's falafel stand in Philadelphia is anti-Semitic, right? And
Yeah.
then even more so to bring that protest to the front of the Hillel in a university in New York is profoundly anti-Semitic. And she said it's essentially the equivalent of to speak out against the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur population might even be a moral mandate to bring that protest to the front step of in Chinatown in New York City would be grossly offensive, right?
Right.
So we have to be able to distinguish between what is a truly justifiable criticism of a terrible war, right? Where so many civilians have died, and it's truly heartbreaking and devastating, and a really dangerous right wing government in Israel, and bringing that protest to Jewish people on the subway, in Paris, or bringing that protest to my kid on a college campus in New York City. That is completely not acceptable. And I want people to know and understand that there is a way to, to even love and support Israel and to fight for Israel to be a just society, a society in which Jews and Christians and Muslims and Druze and Bedouin can all live together in harmony, in which Israelis and Palestinians can actually together build a just future. There's a way to hold that and also be absolutely devastated by the death toll in Gaza, and also be absolutely disgusted by the hardline ultra nationalists that have come really from the mountaintops, pulled from the most extreme voices at the far fringe of Israeli society, and now we're in positions of serious power in Israel's government. And that is actually an expression of patriotic responsibility in some ways, the same way that I felt that it was an expression of my love for America to fly to DC for the Women's March in January of
Mhm.
2017, because I felt like I love this country too much to not fight for it. And so I think that there's a reorientation that needs to happen. And Ashley, I think part of it is that this conversation has become so binary. It's so you're
Mhm.
either pro-Israel or
Or
pro-Palestine.
pro-Palestine. Yeah.
And that makes no sense to people who actually are on the ground there, who understand that. I mean, I was in Jerusalem over the summer, and I would go every night for long walks on this. It's like the High Line in New York City, this kind of redeveloped old train track in West Jerusalem. And literally 50% of the people that I would pass as I would do this like 2 mile, 2 mile walk every night, 50% of the people were Jews, who many of them wearing kippot, or walking with, the Jewish, some religious, some secular. 50% of them are Arab Israeli. They're Palestinian citizens of Israel. They're walking on the same path on, on a hot summer night. They're sitting in the same restaurants. They're drinking beer in the same bars. This is a
Hmm.
mixed society. I think in America there's this sense that these guys win or these guys win, when
Right.
actually the only way out of this horror of our current reality is when we're able to imagine a just society for all of the people of that place, none of whom have anywhere else to go. The Jews
Yeah.
came to Israel because there was nowhere else for them to go. And the Palestinians, nobody's opening their arms saying, please come build your lives here. And so what
Right.
we have to do is use strong moral leadership to help support the efforts of I would say, tens of thousands of Israelis and Palestinians on the ground who are part of a growing peace movement, who are saying the only way forward is together. And what they're saying to us is, do not import the conflict from that region into the diaspora. The last thing we need is college campuses that are like, I'm pro this or pro
Right.
this. We have to be pro humanity. We have to be pro peace. And that is a transformation of the discourse. And I think the only way forward, that's the third way that we have to fight for.
Absolutely. And I think I've seen a lot online, and I'll conflate kind of two questions because, like, as a member of Gen Z on an active college campus, like, I remember just not feeling good post October 7th. Like, there was just, whether it was because I was walking past LAPD to get to class, and as a young black woman, that didn't make me feel safe. I knew that my Jewish classmates didn't feel safe. My Palestinian classmates were watching their families be slaughtered. Like, no one felt safe. No one felt good. People, hostages, like, I could just go on and on about the terrors in college campuses, on the internet. It just was not a time that felt good. But one of the things that I really took away from that was, even with the pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, was this sense of selective empathy, where saying that I cared about one group meant that I could not care for the other group. And this whole notion of, like, deciding, even, it's like, if I was in a similar conflict as a black person with a different racial group, and someone saying, well, just because you guys suffered, I actually care more about this person's ability to live and thrive. And so I just want to know from your perspective, and side note, everybody should go watch Rabbi Brous's TED Talk. I watched it again this morning, on reclaiming religion and what happens when religious extremism takes over. Very, very good tech talk. But to that point, I'd love to know from you what you think happens to the psyche and to the world when we exercise selective empathy. Like, where do we go from here when we're all picking sides and one person's humanity means more than another person's humanity?
Ashley, when you ask this, the first thing I think about is I have a really dear friend who's a black pastor, and her son was tragically shot and killed in a fight, and and it was devastating. He was in his 20s. It was a horrific story, and they found the guy who shot him, and he was brought to justice, and there was a trial, and he was sentenced. And I went with her to the sentencing because she was so torn up over it. And afterwards, someone said to her, "Do you feel like justice was served here? Do you feel like this is, like, are you able to finally take a breath and even celebrate because, because we know that,
Right.
that justice was served?" And she said, "I do feel that justice was served." And she said, "But I can't celebrate anything because now another young black man's going to have his life taken from him because now he's going to go to prison to pay for the life of my young black." She said, "Another black mother is going to be grieving the death, the loss of her
Yeah.
child, the same way I grieve mine." So it's like even she could have empathy for the mother of the man who killed her child. So, I mean, this is obviously, like, I think about her all the time as a model of what it means not to hold selective empathy, but to actually hold true empathy. And what we know happens, I spoke a bit about this over the High Holy Days this year. What we've learned about racism is that when we shut down our hearts towards certain people, whether those people are black people or Jewish people or Palestinian people, and we don't allow ourselves to feel pain when we hear that they've been targeted or they've been harmed. And instead we say, well, I don't care about that. I don't want to hear about that. Change the channel, turn it off. It's their own fault. Let me tell you why the Jews deserved it. Let me tell you why the Palestinians deserved it. I don't believe those numbers. Oh, it's black on black crime. We should be like all the things that people say
Yeah.
to shut themselves off from actually feeling the heartache we should feel when human beings actually suffer. What that does to our hearts is it not only shuts us off to the other, it also shuts us off to our own. It makes us less empathic people. It diminishes our own humanity. And I understand that when we are in trauma and anguish and grief, it is really difficult to stretch open our hearts to see other people, especially people who come from the same group that has caused us harm. And yet that is exactly what we need to do. So as a Jew who has, family and friends that were immediately and directly impacted on October 7th, I understand what it means to say, like, I just can't right now. I just can't. Like, I can't open up my heart and grieve over, the death of Palestinians. And I get why some people responded that way. And I understand because I have Palestinian friends who've lost. My daughter sat with a Palestinian student the other day who said 14 of her cousins were killed in Khan Yunis. 14. And I sat with a friend a couple of months ago who had 142 family members who were killed in Khan Yunis. And I understand why, if you've experienced loss like that, you do not care. You closed your heart. You don't want to think about
Right.
The people who are 101 Israelis who are still held hostage in Gaza. You don't want to think about it. And yet we have to think about each other. We have to think about each other's humanity because they're human beings too. And in the beginning of the Torah, it says that God created Adam, the first person, in God's own image. And our tradition says that means that all people are created in God's own image, right? And so if
Right.
you really believe that every human being is precious and that every life is sacred, that can't mean only every Jewish life is sacred. And it also can't mean every Palestinian life is sacred, but don't tell me about the Jews. And it can't mean only every black life is sacred. It can't mean only every white, like it can't mean any of that. And this is the
Right.
greatest challenge to racism should be the first chapter of the book of Genesis. We're all created in the image of God, every single one of us. And if your heart only breaks for one but not the other, then you're not actually a humanitarian. You don't actually care about human rights. You're only choosing one tribe over another tribe. And ultimately, what we have to do is learn how to love our own tribe and also learn how to love all of humanity. And in so doing, we kind of expand our sense of what tribe even is. So I feel like this too is a kind of transformation in the way that we understand to whom we are responsible. And it only grows our own humanity when we're able to see each other's pain. So when a Jew with family living in Israel, right, deeply connected and deeply invested in Israel's future as a thriving democracy, when I hear a story about a residential building in Gaza that's been hit, I force myself to read that story. And I cry when I read it because it's absolutely devastating to think about all of those people whose lives are lost. And when I read a story about a 23-year-old soldier in Gaza or in Lebanon who's killed in battle, I force myself to read the story about that person and about their family, about their fiance, about how they studied robotics, about how they had dreams of a different kind of future. And I deeply, deeply feel their
Right.
humanity and I weep over that too. And I know that our hearts can hold both.
I think it's so important for our generation to hear this, especially in a time where it is the algorithm is wired for us to feel the divisiveness and the more divisive you are, the more the more appreciation you receive from whatever community you're expressing your division for. And I just love to know from you, kind of as we wrap, is just like your book, The Amen Effect, kind of walks us through the ways in which we can express and hold both and hold all, and build community. And I'd love to know your message to Gen Z and how we can harness the Amen Effect for creating positive political change.
Yeah, I thank you for that question. I'm just going to give 1 minute to kind of explain the framework of the book because I think it will help answer that question.
Yeah.
The book is the central paradigm of the book is it's rooted in this very, very ancient Jewish religious practice. 2,000 years ago, when the temple stood in Jerusalem, Jews used to go up on pilgrimage, and they would go up the steps of the Temple Mount. They would enter through this beautiful arch entryway, and they would turn to the right, and hundreds of thousands of people would circle around the courtyard of the temple, the most sacred space in the holiest city in the world. And it was like the Hajj, right? Like millions of people today go to Mecca to do this circling. Back in the day, it was hundreds of thousands, but Jews would come from all over the land to come do this, except for someone with a broken heart. And that person would go up, but they would go through the same entryway, but they would turn in the opposite direction. So you'd have hundreds of thousands of people walking one way and one person with a broken heart walking the other way. And here, this sacred encounter would occur in which people who are coming this way would stop and look into the eyes of the bereft and the bereaved and the ill and the brokenhearted, and they would say, "Tell me about your broken heart." And the person would answer saying, "I'm grieving," or "I'm broken," or "I'm sick," or "I'm worried." And they would give them a blessing. And then they would say, "May the one who dwells in this place hold you with love as you navigate this difficult time." And then they'd go on their way. And the reason I chose that ritual as kind of the heart of my book is because we're living in a society and in a time in which we do not even want to see each other. We don't want to see the people who are coming from the opposite direction. And we certainly aren't looking at each other with compassion and curiosity and care. And yet I hear the whisper of the ancients saying to us, we have to slow down and see each other. And when we see someone coming from the opposite direction, coming maybe not even toward us, but at us, right? Somebody whose views are really hard for us, to say, I see you. Tell me a little bit about your pain. And we know that that will not diminish our humanity. That will only enlarge our hearts. And that is actually the very essence of how we respond to this divisive, polarized, cruel, callous, racist, misogynistic moment that we're living in, is actually by seeing each other and saying, tell me about your broken heart. Tell me about your sorrow. And me hearing about your sorrow only enhances my own understanding of the human condition. It doesn't mean that suddenly I get why you're, a Trump supporter and I think you're right. It just means that I understand you a little bit more. And I want you to understand me a little bit more. So the message is, at exactly the moment that we feel most inclined to turn away from each other, right? To pretend we don't even see each other, or to run away from each other, or to publicly shame or blame each other on social media, instead to say, hey, do you want to get coffee? I want to understand your position. I really just want to understand it. Like, I want you to tell me about why you would post something like that. What were you thinking? And I want to tell you where my heart is too. And I don't think this is a panacea. I'm not Pollyannish. I don't think that this is going to like solve everything. We need just policies. We need to end bad wars. We need, we need to do all of those
Yeah.
things. And we need a culture shift. And at the heart of that culture shift is a spiritual transformation that will only come when we can look at each other and see the image of God, and see that every single person is worthy of love and respect and life. And when we do that, our hearts soften enough that we can actually work together toward a more just and loving society.
I think that is really such a great way for Gen Z to reimagine our ideological and theological and political division, and figuring out ways to still coexist, because at the end of the day, we're all still on the planet as long as we can be. And so I think that's super, super, super important. I have one final question, and then there's a question that I decided to start this part of the podcast where I have another Gen Z voice ask a question to the guest, because I didn't want to become like the voice of Gen Z in politics. It just didn't really feel like that's the space that I want to hold, considering how vast our generation is. But my last question to you would be, knowing what you've built with Ikar, and we could spend a whole probably 3 hours talking about the magnificence and the revolutionariness, if that's a word, of your creation in that way. But I'd love to know, looking ahead, how you envision the role of faith communities in addressing global challenges, social justice challenges. I know that you guys are building a space to actually house the unhoused, and I would just love to know from you, from that vantage point as a faith leader and running this community, where you see that other people should be stepping in.
Well, I think that somewhere along the line, many of our faith communities have lost the thread. We've forgotten that the work of a faith tradition is not service of the self. It's not just about feeding and nurturing and nourishing myself. It's about feeding and nurturing and nourishing my own spirit, so that I can find the strength to join forces with others and go out and actually build a world worthy of the image of God, which is all the human beings around us. And faith communities are uniquely positioned, because what we do by definition is bring people together. And so we have to actually bring people together for the good. We have to remember that we have a sacred opportunity and a great sense of urgency right now, because we don't have forever. Just the clock is ticking on the climate itself, and let alone all the threats to our democracy, that we have to work together with great urgency to actually build toward the greater good. And I'll just share really briefly that we are, we have at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, we read the story of the building of the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel was when a lot of people got together to do the wrong thing, to build in their own name, to lift themselves up. And actually there's another building project in the Torah, and that building, which we learn about at the end of the book of Exodus, as opposed to the beginning of the book of Genesis, is the building of the Mishkan, or the desert tabernacle. And here this in a very similar way, the people came together, but they came together not to lift themselves, but they came together to build something holy. And I think that the role of faith communities is to remind us of the preciousness of every single human being and the power of the human collective to actually work toward the greater good. And I will say, we built our community when I was 29. This is a community that grew out of a lot of people in their 20s and 30s feeling like we did not see what we were looking for in the religious landscape. I felt like our Jewish tradition carried with it this profound moral mandate that I did not see being made manifest in a lot of our communal spaces. And so this group of young people, I mean, almost everybody was under 40 when we started ICAR. We got together and said, what if we built a community that actually reflected our core values and that was deeply invested in our Jewish tradition and also deeply invested in the world, and that loved our Jewish people and also loved all people, and that was able to make prayer joyous and fun and moving, and also a place where we could grieve together, that could hold all of these sacred tensions, that would honor, us in all of our diversity. And so I really feel to the 20 somethings out there today, it's a really hard time to be alive. And you're right that the algorithm is the algorithm's fighting against us. And yet we have the power to create transformative models of what it could look like when we actually come together to build for the greater good. And I think our most important response to those really strong voices out in the public square right now that are building in very destructive ways, movements that are rooted in conspiracy theories and hatred and racism and destruction and binary thinking, our strongest and best response is to use all of those resources to actually build for the greater good. And I know that this is possible, which is why I remain ever hopeful, ever hopeful about the future.
That is so wonderful. Now, Brian is going to play the video from our last question, and then we'll let you get on with your day.
Hey, Rabbi. My name is Julian Alejandro Barro, and I am calling from New Jersey right now with a question just pertaining to your life's work and what you find to be most memorable in your either sermons or things that you have practiced in day-to-day life to make the lives of minority people in your congregation feel heard and seen.
Thanks, Julian. I'm also from New Jersey, so thank you for your question. Look, I think that this goes very much to what Ashley and I have been talking about during this last hour, which is our deepest work is to actually see and honor each other's humanity. And I was so moved when over the High Holy Days, one of our board members got up to speak, and he said that our community was the first Jewish environment that he'd been in where he wasn't treated like a black Jew and he wasn't treated like a Jew of color. He was just treated like a Jew, meaning you walk in and people say Shabbat Shalom to you. People just welcome you with blessing and don't say, tell me, why are you here? And our community is broad and diverse. And when we look at every person as a unique individual created in God's own image, who only enhances the beauty and diversity and complexity of our faith communities with your own story, your own ideas, your own perspectives, we become better. And I think that that's true not only of our faith communities, I think that's true of our country. I happen to live in Los Angeles now, which is, I think, the most diverse city in the entire world in terms of ethnic background. And that's what makes this city incredible. The diversity and beauty of the city is directly connected to the greatness of this city. And so I feel we have to build communities and we have to build sacred collectives, even so big as the national collective, that actually honor all of our differences and at the same time at the core see all of us, every single one of us, is created in God's own image and therefore worthy of dignity and worthy of love. So thank you for your question. And Ashley, thank you for your beautiful voice in this world. I'm so grateful to know you.
Thank you so, so much for coming on Push the Next Generation, Rabbi. This was such an enlightening conversation, and I really hope that it encourages our generation to see a new way forward, in the words of Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, but to really imagine a moral and just future for all of us to be able to coexist. So thank you for coming on. Wow, that was special. If you want to submit a question to our guest, DM at Push the Next Generation Pod for a chance to make it onto future episodes. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Push the Next Generation, recommend it to a friend, follow on socials at Push the Next Generation Pod. And thank you so much for watching and listening. See you next week on Push the Next Generation. In the meantime, get some rest. This is Ashley Jackson, signing off.